Hey, I'm Adam, and welcome to our first recap video for Module 3, Lesson 1 here of The Greatest Story Ever. This lesson is, or the whole module is the law, the desert, and the judges. I'm super excited about this. This is some of the most difficult, probably, of Scripture to work through and try to figure out what we're supposed to be getting out of it, which I think is probably why it's one of my favorites as well, because if we're able to do that, then it's just really rewarding. So we have a lot to get through here in this first lesson. For those of you who are with me in class, you know that is true. My apologies that we had to rush so fast to the end, but I'm gonna skip really quickly through our first couple of chapters here so that we can get to the tabernacle, which I want to spend a little bit more time on this video. So let's go ahead and jump right on in to Exodus 16. Exodus 16 here, the key is, and first of all, for a little bit of context, so this is post Red Sea, right? So the Israelites have come out of the Red Sea. They are out into the desert now, start beginning to journey and walk around. And we have now very quickly, we come up on a couple of problems. And in Exodus 16, the problem is there's not enough food. And the people begin to complain and they say, what are we going to do? There's no food for us. And God, we see here in Exodus 16, provides for the people manna. So this is the manna chapter, right? This is a famous story here in the book of Exodus. And the first thing that we have to kind of wrap our minds around is, what does bread, this bread from heaven, this mysterious bread that falls on the ground and people are able to pick it up and eat it, what does this bread represent in all biblical narratives? Not even just this chapter here in Exodus 16, but certainly Exodus 16 fits and falls within what we see in the overall biblical narrative for bread. And the answer is life, right? Sustenance, but certainly also specifically God's provision, that God provides the sustenance. God provides life for people. And certainly that comes out here as God is the one who provides this mysterious manna for the people. What we're going to do, and just a really quick aside, if you have not gotten a chance yet to go back and watch some of the previous videos from the last session that I posted and emailed out, I highly recommend actually that you stop this one and go and watch those first. Specifically, last session, which was Module 2, Lessons 3A and 3B, where we really hit the redemptive historical lens of Scripture, because I'm going to jump right into the redemptive historical lens here as though everyone is with me and you kind of follow what we're doing and why. But if that's not true, then I definitely want you to go to watch those first so that you're not like, I don't know, this is crazy. What are you even saying here? Why are you comparing all this stuff to Jesus? So that's going to be a really key one for you. But if you are with me, if you remember our redemptive historical lens, and that all of these narratives are building a story, they're building a pathway through which God is going to redeem and save all his people and eventually the entire world through Christ. Christ is the climax of the story, we said, right? His life and death and resurrection. Everything is building to that. Everything that we're seeing now is a picture and a hint of Christ to come. So, here we find Jesus himself. If we go all the way to John, we're moving forward, John 6:35, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. And in this statement that Jesus makes here in the book of John, Jesus is going to connect himself now to all of it, to all of the narratives that talk about bread and life and sustenance. Jesus says, it's me. And most certainly here in Exodus 16, Jesus is connecting himself to the manna in John 6 when he says that he is the bread. He is the bread of life. He is that sustenance that God has provided to the people ultimately to fulfill them, not just to satiate their hunger, for the meantime, but forever. Eternally, Christ accomplishes this for us. When we look at specifically verse 12 here in Exodus 16, I think this is a key verse, and I wanted to highlight this because God says to the people, I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, and he's speaking to Moses here, say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, because God provides quail in addition to the manna here, right? And in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then, here's a key verse, then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. And I think this is a real key to understanding what God is doing, not just what he's doing, but why he's doing it. He says, you shall know that I am the Lord. Why? Because I take care of and love my people. And I think if we want to take this a step further, it's also important that we see not only does God love and take care of his people, but it is only through God's provision and God providing the sustenance for his people that they have any chance whatsoever to survive and persist as a people. They must rely on God. And this is going to be a real key as we move now into Exodus 17 as well, because 16 and 17, I think both of them are providing us a very similar lesson. And that lesson is that God is bringing them to a place where they need to see that that is true. And if it takes them being a little bit hungry, or in Exodus 17, a little bit thirsty, for them to realize, like, we are in a place where only God can save us, and then he does, this is going to be really important for the people moving on as they try to reestablish this connection with God. Because remember that the people coming out of Egypt, their relationship with God is really different. Generation after generation of people being in Egypt and under those conditions and being slaves has led them to a place where, the prayer rhythms and that close, intimate relationship with God that the people may have had at other points in the narrative, and certainly eventually get to in later parts of the narrative, is not true here. It's not true at this time. That God feels kind of like a distant person, a distant entity to them. And the people aren't really sure how to connect with God and how to understand and love him. And so we really see God here having to kind of take drastic measures to rebuild that relationship and rebuild that trust that the people can have in him. And I think that's a key reason why God puts them in this really precarious position where they literally don't have anything to eat, and then as we move to Exodus 17, they don't have anything to drink either. Okay, so let's move to 17. 17, we could title this one The Rock, the water from the rock. And if the grumbling began in Exodus 16, we see it come to an absolute head here in Exodus 17. The frustration, the questioning of Israel is really, really extreme here as we get to 17. It began in 16, and now it's really boiling over. The people are brought to a place with no water, we said. And we already kind of talked about the answer or the question of why. Why would God do that to them? Clearly, it's because he needs them to see their reliance on him and that he is the provider. He is the sustainer of them as a people. But the people confront Moses. They go after Moses here and they say, look, you're the leader and you brought us to this place and this is not going to work for us. And later, as Moses is talking to God about the situation, he mentions, almost as an aside, but I think we shouldn't overlook this verse, the people were ready to stone me. And that is absolutely true. The people are close to a riot here, I think. They're so angry with Moses and the situation that they're in. And this is really interesting because God, his response to this is to gather the elders together. He tells Moses, go gather the elders and come back to this large rock and I will meet you there. And the question is, what is God doing? And the answer, I think, is that he is organizing a trial. because the elders would have certainly been involved in a trial situation at this time in Israel's history. If someone were going on a trial, and we're talking about a major issue, right? Small, minor things the judge would handle, and Moses is actually the one who acts as judge, sometimes Aaron as well, for the people at this point. But if it's not a minor thing, if it's a major thing that Moses himself or Aaron himself can't handle, all the elders are going to be brought in. And so that's what's going on here. God's calling for the elders, and he says, let's have a trial. If you want to put someone on trial, let's have a trial. And the crux of the issue of the trial, I think, is summarized here in Exodus 17:7, where the people ask, basically, is God with us or not? Is God actually leading us to a good place, or is God hanging us out to dry? And this is really important because we have to see that they were mad at Moses, but God has now kind of replaced Moses being the one on trial with himself. He says, I'll meet you at the rock. Let's have the trial, but it's going to be me on trial, not Moses. He asked Moses also to bring his staff. Now, what's going on here? What does the staff represent? The staff in the Old Testament represents authority, and it represents judgment. And we see both of these things are true out of the story that we just came out of here in Exodus, because we've seen Moses already use his staff. He uses it to convince both the elders and the Egyptians that he represents God, this higher power, when God does this sort of mysterious trick where the staff turns into a serpent and then he picks it up and it turns back into a staff again. He also has used it to turn the Nile into blood. God tells him to put his staff into the Nile River and it turns red with blood. And then also as he parts the Red Sea, God commands him to put the staff down into the water, and then God, through the staff, parts the water. Okay, so this is an important staff, and God has already been using it to establish his and Moses' authority and his judgment against Egypt. So now we have the staff of authority and judgment, and God says, bring it down on what? On this rock. And he hits the rock, and from the rock, water begins to flow. River of water flows out, and the people have enough to drink. So this is a really cool story. We might miss the overarching significance of the story if we don't then go to the New Testament and see what the New Testament has to say about this story. And in terms of looking at typologies, this is an easy one because Paul does all of the work for us here in establishing this rock specifically as a type of Christ, as a type that points us to Jesus to come. And Paul tells us that in 1 Corinthians 10:4, for they drank of the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was, Paul says, Christ. He is saying the rock is a type of Christ. It's pointing us to Jesus. And so this is really important. How is Jesus like the rock? Well, let's look at the result of what happens. We have living water to quench all thirst. And that's what Jesus says he is in John 4:13-14, as he is talking to the Samaritan woman at the well. He tells her, you're thirsty and you're going to this well for your water, but I tell you that you should be actually seeking out a living water that will quench your thirst eternally, forever. You'll never get thirsty again. And so Jesus here is certainly connecting himself, as we see, to this water, and that is what Christ provides for us is this sustenance and this life eternally, not just the thirst that we have in the moment. And then second of all, the other cool thing that I wanted to point out is in John 7:37 and 38, Jesus also makes a connection here to water, and he says, Sorry, it took me a second to turn. John says Jesus says in John 7:37 through 38, that if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. Okay, so what is going on? Well, Jesus makes this statement at the Feast of Tabernacles. And the Feast of Tabernacles is important because during this ceremony, a priest would go and they would take an animal and sacrifice it on the altar, and then they would pour, using this golden pitcher, buckets of water on top of the sacrifice, and from the sacrifice would flow some mixture of water and blood. And Jesus is saying, you see the rivers of water before you, here in John 37. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow these rivers of water. So Jesus is connecting himself to this ritual and saying the ritual is trying to signify the cleansing of your sin, right? That's what the priest is doing when he pours the water on top of this altar and the sacrifice. And Jesus is certainly using this symbolism of the water flowing from the rock as he makes this connection, and thinking about, Jesus hanging on the cross and the spear piercing his side, and from his side flow a mixture of blood and water, the scripture tells us, just as would have happened here at the Feast of Tabernacles in John 7, and Jesus makes this connection for us. Very cool stuff, very, very cool stuff. Okay, let's jump to the tabernacle. I wanted to spend a little bit more time on the tabernacle. We do have a little bit of time that we can run through some really cool stuff with the tabernacle. First of all, let me just say, even that I have 8 or 9 minutes here to run through the tabernacle, which was more than I had, unfortunately, at class. That is not nearly enough time. We could preach a whole sermon series on how the tabernacle shows us so much cool stuff about Jesus to come. It's just an absolute treasure trove of connections and pictures and symbols of Jesus. And each one is cooler than the last, to be honest. And so we'll only have time to scratch the surface here, but hopefully it's enough to kind of get your engines going, right, a little bit, and hopefully that you see this amazing, incredible, beautiful picture of Jesus to come here through the tabernacle. Okay, so as we take a little tour through the tabernacle, I want to kind of go through, and you should have if you weren't here at class, I will give you a handout that gives you a picture of the tabernacle and what it looks like in all the parts as we go through it. But we're going to start obviously at the gate. The gate is a good place to start. The gate of the tabernacle would have been this crazy place, just absolute hubbub, chaos, as people kind of were running to try to get in front of each other and squeeze in and get into the tabernacle to make their sacrifices, which means they would have been holding like goats and lambs, living ones that would have been bleeding and, making crazy noise. And so this would have been just kind of a crazy scene as people are trying to get into this gate. And it was so important that they were able to. And in John 10:9, we find Jesus saying, I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. Now, when we see Jesus say this in John, we're not thinking of the tabernacle, right? We don't understand. We don't have the history that the people of Israel would with the tabernacle and the temple, and we wouldn't think that what Jesus is making a connection here to the gate of the temple, the gate of the tabernacle. But absolutely the people of Israel during the time of Jesus would have known that he's making this connection. And they would have seen him saying, you need to go through the gate in order to save yourself and your family and your tribe and to have these sacrifices made on your behalf. I am that gate. I am your entrance into salvation. So this is a really cool first thing that Jesus makes this connection to. Okay, so as you get past the gate, the next thing you're going to come to is the altar, the brazen altar. This is the place to make animal sacrifices. And this is going to make us a little squeamish. I know. I had people raise their hand in class, and everyone said, yes, the idea of sacrificing animals on these altars, it's a little weird, this feels a little awkward, makes us feel a little squeamish. But let's try to put ourselves in the context of the time that all this is happening. Because the reality is today, where and when we live, we don't have to kill animals for food, right? When I'm hungry and I want a burger, I can go up to, Five Guys, or I can go to Walmart or Hy-Vee and buy patties that the animals have been slaughtered already, and they've already, packed the meat into ready-made little patties that I can just take home and throw on the grill, and it's great, it's perfect. But this was not the case back then, right? If you wanted to eat and you wanted your family to eat back then and have meat, you raised your own animals and you killed them, you slaughtered them yourself. So during this time period, the weird thing would not have been killing an animal, right? Not at all. The weird thing, or the difficult thing, the challenge that they would have faced would have been that they are sacrificing something that's really valuable. These are the animals that they need for meat and sustenance. And now they have to go and make a sacrifice and not use that for food, but instead to use that in this symbolic ritual that absolves them of sin. Okay? So certainly the idea here, this is a very an act of humility on their part, because they have to admit, first of all, I have committed wrongdoing. I have sinned against God and against the people around me in such a way that I need my sins to be covered by something. And then also, it's a great sacrifice. It requires great faith in God that He would both provide and forgive them of their sins, that He would provide for their family in other ways. If I sacrifice the best, healthiest animal that I have, then God is going to have to provide in some other way for my family, and I have to have faith that what I'm doing is worth something, that God is actually going to be able to forgive me of my sin. Now the question is going to pop up: so really, sacrificing these animals that actually covers the people's sins? The answer is no and yes. And if you're curious about that answer, then come back with us next week, because we're going to go into sacrifice a little bit deeper and talk a little bit more about that in our next class session. For now, let's keep moving through the tabernacle, and we come to the laver. The laver is going to be this very large kind of bowl of water that's set on a stand that we can use to wash our hands with. Jesus here is going to be connected to the laver because if we go to the book of Ephesians, chapter 5, it tells us, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. So the idea here is that this idea that you had to wash your hands to no longer let them be dirty, right, as you got closer and closer into the presence of God. Christ said, Ephesians tells us that Christ came to wash and cleanse the church, just as the laver was used to cleanse your hands as you came into the presence of God. Okay, let's keep going. Now, at this point, only priests can keep going, right? If you're a regular, everyday person, you've gone only the priest could actually make it to the laver, and so you've come further than you're able to. And now the priests can walk into the actual tent, the tabernacle, and inside of the tabernacle, we're going to see the lampstand. The lampstand is a light. It's the only light that exists here within the tabernacle, and it lights the darkness so that one can see God and move closer to him. Jesus in John 8 says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus is saying, if you want to see God, if you want to know the way to God as you make your way deeper and deeper into the tabernacle, it's me. I'm the lampstand. I am the light that shines, that helps you to see and find your path to God. Okay, finally, this is called the holy place. If we want to go a step further into the Holy of Holies, only one priest could do this, and only on a special occasion. And that priest would have to spend an entire week cleansing himself and getting himself ready to enter into the holy presence of God. Why? Because the presence of God is so holy, it is overwhelming to someone who is unholy. To enter into and find himself in that presence might overwhelm you to the point of death. And so it was so dangerous that that one priest would have to have a rope tied around his waist and bells put on it in case he died while he was in there, and they could pull him back out and they could hear if he was dead or not. Okay, Jesus, upon his death, it says that Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit, and behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. This is everything. This is such a huge verse, a huge statement, because the idea is that the veil protected you from that presence of God, because you needed that protection, because God's presence was so overwhelming to an unholy person who was not spiritually ready to enter into the presence of God. But upon Jesus' death on the cross, we see that everything has changed. We no longer need protection from God's overwhelming presence, and Jesus is the one who has changed all of that with his death on the cross. Okay, we'll stop there for now. We'll get to dive a little bit deeper into the ark and some cool stuff next week, and certainly we're going to talk a little bit more about the law. So please join us, and we'll see you then. Bye for now.